The night Sandra Williams took her last breath, the Florida sky was painted in shades of deep crimson and burnt orange. I remember reading about that sunset years later, how witnesses described it as almost prophetic, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding for what was about to unfold in that quiet Pensacola neighborhood. But here is what keeps me awake at night, what made me spend years piecing together every fragment of this case. A killer walked free for nearly 2 decades. He lived among neighbors, attended community events, perhaps even looked Sandra's grieving family in the eyes without a single tremor of guilt. And the most chilling part? He thought he had gotten away with murder. He was wrong. Before you continue watching, I need you to understand something. Stories like this one, they do not get told unless people share them. Unless you share them. Right now, someone you know needs to hear about Sandra Williams, about the 19 years her family spent in agonizing uncertainty, about the moment justice finally arrived at Benjamin Holmes Jr.'s door. So do this for Sandra. Subscribe to this channel and share this video. Because the dead cannot speak, but we can speak for them. Let me take you back to 2001. The world was different then. We were still reeling from the tragedy of September 11th. Still trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt dangerous and unpredictable. But for the residents of Pensacola, Florida, danger was not some abstract concept playing out on television screens. It was right there in their community, walking their streets, breathing their air. Sandra Williams was 47 years old, a woman whose smile could light up rooms and whose kindness was legendary among those who knew her. She worked hard, loved deeply, and had built a life that, while not extravagant, was rich in the ways that truly mattered. She had friends who would do anything for her, family members who cherished every moment in her presence, and a community that respected her. Sandra was the kind of person who made the world a little bit better simply by existing in it. Her home was modest, a small house on a street where neighbors still waved at each other, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where people left their doors unlocked because they trusted each other. That trust, that sense of community, was about to be shattered in a way that would echo through nearly 2 decades. The evening of the murder started like any other. Sandra had finished her day, probably exhausted from work, looking forward to a quiet night at home. Maybe she planned to watch television, call a friend, or simply enjoy the peace that comes with having your own space. What she did not plan for, what she could not have anticipated, was the monster that would cross her threshold. Benjamin Holmes Jr. was not a stranger to the neighborhood. That is what made this case so particularly horrifying. He was not some drifter passing through town, not an anonymous face from a distant place. He was someone who belonged there, someone who had relationships and connections, someone who understood the rhythms and patterns of that community. And he used that knowledge, that insider status, to commit an act of unspeakable violence. The details of what happened inside Sandra's home that night are difficult to recount. Even now, after years of studying this case, I find myself pausing before the more brutal aspects. Sandra was attacked with a ferocity that spoke to something deeply broken inside her killer. This was not a crime of desperation or even a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was rage. This was evil in its most concentrated form. When Sandra's body was discovered, the community reacted with shock and horror. How could this happen here? How could someone they might have passed on the street, nodded to at the grocery store, be capable of such violence? The questions multiplied, but answers remained frustratingly elusive. The Pensacola Police Department launched an immediate investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed anyone who might have seen something suspicious, collected evidence from the crime scene. But in 2001, forensic technology was not what it is today. DNA evidence existed, yes, but the databases were limited, the testing procedures slower, the science itself still evolving. Investigators gathered what they could, preserved what they found, but the crucial link, the piece that would connect Benjamin Holmes Jr. to the crime, remained hidden. Weeks turned into months. The initial flurry of media attention faded as other stories captured the public's attention. But for Sandra's family, there was no moving on. There was no new story to distract them from their grief. Every morning, they woke up without her. Every holiday, her chair sat empty. Every birthday that passed was a reminder of the years being stolen not just from Sandra, but from everyone who loved her. The detectives on the case never forgot either. In police work, there is something called a cold case, a file that sits in a drawer, unsolved, but never truly closed. Sandra's case became one of these, but unlike many cold cases that gather dust and fade from memory, this one had champions. Investigators who refused to let Sandra become just another statistic, just another unsolved homicide in a country that sees far too many of them. But here is what Benjamin Holmes Jr. did not understand as he went about his life in the years following the murder. Time was not his ally. It was his enemy. Every technological advancement, every improvement in DNA analysis, every new database that came online was a step closer to his capture. He thought he was safe. He thought the trail had gone cold enough to never be found. He thought wrong. The evidence collected from Sandra's home in 2001 was carefully preserved, waiting for the day when science would catch up to the crime. And that day was coming. Slowly, inevitably, it was coming. To understand how Benjamin Holmes Jr. escaped justice for so long, you need to understand the limitations of criminal investigation in the early 2000s. We like to think of forensic science as infallible, as this perfect system that catches every criminal and solves every crime. Television shows have given us this fantasy, this idea that a single hair or fingerprint can solve a murder in 60 minutes minus commercial breaks. The reality is far messier, far more frustrating, and infinitely more human. In 2001, DNA technology existed but was still in its relative infancy. The combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, had been established just a few years earlier. While it represented a revolutionary step forward in criminal identification, the database was limited. You could only match DNA to someone who was already in the system, and Benjamin Holmes Jr., at the time of Sandra's murder, was not. He had managed to exist below the radar, avoiding the kind of arrests that would have required DNA collection. The investigators working Sandra's case were good at their jobs. They knew something terrible had happened, and they had collected evidence that pointed to a specific perpetrator. But without a match, without a name to attach to the biological evidence, they were stuck. It was like having a key without knowing which door it opened in a city of millions of doors. Detective Marcus Thompson, who worked the case in its early years, would later describe the frustration as almost unbearable. Here was a woman who had been brutally murdered, a family that deserved answers, a community that needed closure, and the solution seemed to be right there, tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant. The DNA profile sat in the system, waiting, hoping, practically begging for a match that would not come for years. Meanwhile, Benjamin Holmes Jr. lived his life. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of cases like this. While families grieve, while investigators lose sleep, while communities try to heal, the perpetrator simply continues existing. Holmes went to work. He had relationships. He laughed at jokes, celebrated birthdays, complained about the weather. He did all the mundane things that make up a human life, all while carrying the secret of what he had done to Sandra Williams. Psychologists who study criminal behavior talk about compartmentalization, the ability of some individuals to separate their actions into different mental boxes. Holmes must have been exceptionally skilled at this. To function normally while knowing you have taken a life, while understanding that evidence of your crime exists somewhere waiting to condemn you, requires a particular kind of mental architecture. Whether this represents true sociopathy or an elaborate coping mechanism, the effect is the same. A killer walked among the innocent, invisible in his guilt. The years passed with a rhythm that felt cruel to those who loved Sandra. 2002 came and went. Then 2003, 2004, 2005. Each December 31st, as the rest of the world celebrated new beginnings, Sandra's family marked another year without answers. Hope did not die, not entirely, but it transformed into something quieter, something that lived in the background rather than the forefront of their lives. The cold case unit that eventually inherited Sandra's file was staffed by detectives who specialized in the impossible. These were investigators who chose to spend their careers looking backward, sifting through old evidence, revisiting witnesses, searching for the detail that everyone else had missed. It is a particular kind of calling, this work with the dead. It requires patience measured in years rather than weeks, and a faith that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. They reviewed everything about Sandra's case. The crime scene photographs, though difficult to examine, were studied again with fresh eyes. The witness statements, some now decades old, were reread and analyzed. The physical evidence, still preserved, was inventoried and assessed for new testing possibilities. And the DNA, that crucial piece of biological truth, was submitted again to a database that had grown exponentially since 2001. By the late 2010s, Cody's contained millions of profiles. Arrestees from across the country had been added, convicted offenders were mandatorily included in most states, and familial DNA searching had become an increasingly powerful tool. The system that had failed to identify Holmes in 2001 had become a vast web that was growing harder and harder to escape. But what made the difference in this case was not just the expansion of the database. It was the combination of that expansion with renewed investigative interest. Cold case detectives are often accused of being obsessive, and perhaps there is truth to that. But their obsession serves a purpose. It keeps cases alive when everything else would let them die. The detective who ultimately cracked Sandra's case, whose name has been kept somewhat protected to allow continued work on other investigations, described the moment of the DNA match as both triumphant and sobering. After nearly 2 decades, a name finally appeared next to the biological evidence. Benjamin Holmes Jr. The key had found its door. The moment that DNA match came through, everything changed. Suddenly, a case that had been cold for nearly 19 years blazed back to life with an intensity that caught even veteran investigators off guard. Benjamin Holmes Jr. was no longer a phantom. He was a man with an address, a history, a life that was about to come crashing down around him. But here is something important to understand. A DNA match, as powerful as it is, does not automatically equal a conviction. It is a piece of evidence, perhaps the most compelling piece in many cases, but prosecutors need more. They need context. They need to establish opportunity. They need to understand the relationship, if any, between the suspect and the victim. They need to build a case that will survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. Investigators began the delicate work of surveillance and research. They needed to know everything about Benjamin Holmes Jr. Where did he work? What was his daily routine? Who were his associates? Had he committed other crimes in the intervening years? Was he aware that the investigation had been reopened? Every piece of information mattered, and every step had to be taken carefully to avoid alerting their suspect before they were ready to move. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had successfully hidden in plain sight. Holmes had not fled to another state or assumed a new identity. He remained in Florida, living a life that appeared, on the surface, unremarkable. He had employment history, relationships, a social circle. Nothing about his public persona suggested the violence he was capable of, the violence he had demonstrated in Sandra's home nearly 2 decades earlier. This is what evil often looks like, I think. Not obviously monstrous, not wearing its darkness on its sleeve, but camouflaged in normalcy. We want villains to be identifiable, to have some mark that sets them apart from the rest of us. But the truth is far more unsettling. The person who commits an atrocity can look exactly like the person who would never dream of it. As investigators built their case, they also reached out to Sandra's family. Imagine receiving that phone call after 19 years of silence. Imagine having resigned yourself to never knowing, having built some fragile peace around the absence of answers, and then suddenly being told that they found him, that they know who killed your loved one. The emotions must have been overwhelming, a complex mixture of relief, rage, grief renewed, and perhaps even fear that something could still go wrong. Sandra's family had never stopped believing that this day would come. That faith, maintained through nearly 2 decades of disappointment, was finally being rewarded. But they also knew that an arrest was just the beginning. The criminal justice system is slow, deliberate, and not always reliable. They had waited 19 years for a suspect. Now they would have to wait again, through booking and arraignment, and preliminary hearings, and potential trial, for something approaching closure. Let me pause here to ask you something. What would you do if you were in their position? If someone you loved was taken from you violently, and then you spent 19 years waiting for justice, how would that change you? Would you become consumed by anger? Would you find some way to move forward while holding space for hope? Would you lose faith in the system entirely, or would you cling to belief that eventually, somehow, truth would prevail? Think about that. Think about the strength it requires to wait, year after year, for something that might never come. And then leave a comment below telling me what you think you would do, how you think you would survive that kind of prolonged uncertainty. The arrest of Benjamin Holmes Jr. was executed with precision that reflected the seriousness of the charge. There would be no mistakes, no technicalities that could derail the case before it even began. When officers approached him, when they read him his rights, when they placed him in handcuffs, 19 years of hiding came to an abrupt and decisive end. His reaction in that moment has been described as surprisingly subdued. Perhaps he had always known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this day would eventually arrive. Perhaps the years of apparent freedom had been haunted by the awareness that evidence existed, that science was advancing, that his past was never truly buried. Or perhaps he was simply skilled at controlling his emotions, even in a moment of personal catastrophe. The mugshot taken that day shows a man who had aged significantly since 2001. Time had passed for him as it had for everyone else. But there is something different about looking at the face of someone who spent those years as a free man when they should have been behind bars. Every year of that face represents a year stolen from justice, a year during which Sandra's family suffered without answers, a year during which the community lived with an unresolved wound. The charges against Holmes were serious. First-degree murder carries enormous weight in the Florida legal system, and prosecutors were determined to pursue the maximum penalty. They believed they had not just DNA evidence, but a case that could demonstrate premeditation, that could show the deliberate and calculated nature of what Holmes had done to Sandra Williams. The legal process that followed Benjamin Holmes Jr.'s arrest was meticulous in a way that sometimes frustrated those seeking quick justice. But this deliberate pace served a purpose. After waiting 19 years, no one wanted to risk a conviction being overturned on appeal due to procedural errors or rushed preparation. Holmes secured legal representation, as was his right. His attorneys would examine every piece of evidence, challenge every assumption, question every procedure. This is how the adversarial system works, and while it can seem to favor the accused, it also ensures that when a conviction comes, it stands on solid ground. The prosecution's case centered on the DNA evidence, but it was far from their only weapon. Over the course of the investigation, both old and renewed, they had assembled additional information that painted a picture of Holmes as more than capable of the crime charged. His connection to the area, his movements around the time of the murder, circumstances that might suggest motive, all of these elements were woven into a narrative designed to leave no reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Sandra's family attended every hearing, every procedural appearance, every moment when they could occupy space in the same room as the man accused of taking her life. There is something powerful about that physical presence, that refusal to be invisible or forgotten. They were there to remind everyone, the judge, the attorneys, the defendant himself, that this case was not just about legal abstractions. It was about a real woman who had lived, who had mattered, who deserved justice. The emotional toll of these proceedings cannot be overstated. Each appearance required Sandra's loved ones to relive their loss, to sit in proximity to violence, to maintain composure when every instinct might have screamed for something more cathartic. The criminal justice system asks tremendous sacrifice from victims and their families, and that sacrifice was paid in full by those who loved Sandra Williams. Holmes's defense attempted various strategies common in cases built on DNA evidence. They questioned chain of custody, the possibility of contamination, the reliability of the testing procedures used. None of these challenges gained significant traction. The evidence had been properly collected, carefully preserved, and tested using methodologies that had been validated and accepted by courts across the country. What the defense could not do was explain away the presence of Holmes's DNA at the crime scene in a manner consistent with innocence. This is the power of biological evidence. It places a person in a specific location with a specificity that other forms of evidence cannot match. Holmes could not claim he had never been in Sandra's home. The evidence said otherwise, loudly and irrefutably. As the case progressed toward its conclusion, the community that had been wounded by Sandra's murder began to pay closer attention. People who had known her, who remembered the fear and grief that followed her death, found themselves drawn to the proceedings. Some attended in person when possible. Others followed through media coverage. All shared a sense that something important was happening, that a chapter long left open was finally being closed. The wait between Holmes's arrest and the resolution of his case was measured in months rather than years. But for those who had already waited so long, each day carried enormous weight. Would something go wrong? Would there be some unexpected development that derailed justice? The fear was understandable, born of nearly 2 decades during which nothing had gone right. But finally, the moment arrived. The culmination of investigation, prosecution, and legal process produced a result. Benjamin Holmes Jr. was convicted. The evidence against him, particularly that DNA evidence that had waited so patiently for science and circumstance to align, proved insurmountable. A jury of his peers heard the case, evaluated the facts, and reached a verdict that affirmed what investigators had known since that DNA match. Holmes was responsible for Sandra Williams' death. The courtroom reaction to the verdict was emotional in ways that words struggle to capture. Sandra's family, who had maintained such dignity throughout the proceedings, finally allowed themselves to express the full weight of their grief and their relief. Tears flowed freely. Embraces were exchanged. Voices that had stayed steady through testimony and arguments broke with the release of nearly 2 decades of tension. Justice had arrived. It was 19 years late, but it had arrived. The conviction of Benjamin Holmes Jr. was not the end of his legal journey, but it was the decisive turning point. Sentencing would follow, and with it, the determination of how he would spend the remainder of his days. But the verdict itself carried a significance that transcended any particular punishment. It said, loudly and officially, that Sandra Williams mattered, that her death would not go unanswered, that the man who killed her would be held accountable. Holmes was sentenced to a term that ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, spoke not just to the severity of the crime, but to the years of suffering that Holmes had caused by evading capture. Sandra's family had been victimized not once, but continuously, their grief compounded by uncertainty, their healing delayed by the absence of justice. The sentence reflected not just the murder itself, but its enduring aftermath. The prison that would become Holmes's permanent home was far removed from the freedom he had enjoyed for 19 years. Every sunrise that he had witnessed as a free man, every choice he had made about his own life, every simple pleasure he had experienced while Sandra's family suffered, all of that was now over. His world narrowed to the dimensions of a cell, to the rhythms of institutional life, to the company of other men who had forfeited their place in society through their crimes. I think about what those 19 years of freedom must have been like for Holmes. Did he sleep easily, or did his crime haunt his dreams? Did he think of Sandra on the anniversary of her death, or had he managed to bury her memory along with her body? Did he ever come close to confessing, to unburdening himself of his secret? We may never know the answers to these questions. Some aspects of a criminal's inner life remain forever hidden. What we do know is that his freedom was always borrowed time. The evidence against him existed from the moment of the crime. It was simply waiting for the world to catch up, for technology to advance, for the right investigator to take the right interest at the right moment. Holmes thought he had escaped, but in reality, he was simply running down a clock that would eventually expire. The resolution of Sandra's case had ripple effects beyond the immediate participants. It sent a message to other cold case investigators, other families waiting for answers, other communities with unsolved crimes. Do not give up. Science continues to advance. Databases continue to grow. Cases that seem unsolvable today may yield to tomorrow's techniques. This message of hope, born from tragedy, has proven powerful. In the years since Holmes's conviction, there has been renewed interest in cold cases across the country. Agencies that had allowed files to gather dust have reopened investigations. Families who had resigned themselves to never knowing have found reason to believe again. The technology that caught Holmes, that DNA matching capability that had evolved so dramatically since 2001, continues to identify perpetrators of long-ago crimes. For Sandra's family, the conviction brought something they had almost stopped hoping for: the ability to grieve without the additional burden of uncertainty. They knew now who had killed their loved one. They knew he was being punished. They could visit her grave, speak to her memory, and tell her that justice had been served. The wound would never fully heal, the loss would never stop hurting, but the infection of not knowing had finally been cleansed. The community of Pensacola, too, found a measure of closure. The fear that had lingered since 2001, the awareness that a killer might still be among them, was finally resolved. Parents who had worried about their children's safety could breathe a little easier. Neighbors who had looked at each other with suspicion could rebuild the trust that Sandra's murder had damaged. The communal wound, like the personal wounds of Sandra's loved ones, could finally begin to heal properly. But here's what I find most remarkable about this case. Despite everything, despite the 19 years of injustice, despite the pain and the waiting and the fear, the system ultimately worked. Not perfectly, not quickly, but eventually and effectively. The investigators who never forgot Sandra, the scientists who developed better testing methods, the prosecutors who built an unshakable case, the jury that delivered a just verdict, all of these people and institutions came together to ensure that Benjamin Holmes Jr. faced accountability for his crime. The years following Benjamin Holmes Jr.'s conviction have been marked by continued developments in cold case investigation and forensic science. Sandra Williams's case, while unique in its specific details, has become part of a larger story about justice delayed and eventually delivered. It stands as evidence that the past is never truly past, that crimes once considered unsolvable can yield to persistence and technological advancement. The detective who helped crack Sandra's case, who spent countless hours reviewing old evidence and pursuing new leads, has continued working on other long-dormant investigations. There is something almost sacred about this work, this dedication to the dead and to those who love them. Not every case will be solved, not every family will receive the answers they deserve, but each effort matters. Each cold case examined is another chance for justice. For those who worked on Sandra's case over the years, from the first responders who found her body to the forensic specialists who analyzed the DNA, the conviction of Holmes brought professional satisfaction of the deepest kind. They had done their jobs. They had honored their obligations to the victim, to the community, to the abstract but vital concept of justice. Their work had meaning, and that meaning had been validated in the most definitive way possible. I want to talk about Sandra herself for a moment, to bring our focus back to the woman at the center of this story. It can be easy, in cases like this, to become so focused on the perpetrator and the investigation that we lose sight of the victim. But Sandra Williams was not just a case number or a piece of evidence. She was a complete human being with dreams and fears, with loved ones and daily routines, with a life that was cut brutally short. The people who knew Sandra remember her warmth. They remember her laugh, her kindness, her way of making those around her feel valued and seen. These memories, shared among family and friends, have kept her alive in the most important sense even as they mourned her physical absence. Sandra's legacy is not defined by her death, but by the life she lived before that terrible night. In the years since the conviction, Sandra's family has worked to honor her memory in various ways. Some have become advocates for victims' rights, using their experience to help others navigate the difficult journey through the criminal justice system. Others have focused on healing, on building lives that acknowledge loss while refusing to be defined by it. All have shown remarkable strength in the face of unimaginable circumstances. There is a temptation to end stories like this with simple closure, to suggest that the conviction of the perpetrator neatly resolves all the pain and trauma caused by the crime. But reality is more complex. Sandra's family will carry their loss forever. The trauma of her death, compounded by 19 years of waiting, has left marks that will never fully fade. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not erase the past. It simply ensures that the past is properly acknowledged and that wrongdoers face consequences. What justice does provide, however, is the ability to move forward without the additional burden of injustice. Sandra's loved ones no longer have to wonder if her killer will ever be caught. They no longer have to fear that he might claim another victim. They no longer have to live with the particular kind of uncertainty that accompanies unsolved violent crime. These are not small gifts. They are, in fact, essential to any meaningful healing. The broader community of Pensacola has also moved forward, though the memory of what happened to Sandra remains part of the local consciousness. In many ways, her case has strengthened community bonds. People who came together in grief and fear in 2001 found themselves united again, nearly 2 decades later, in relief and a renewed sense of justice. The story of Sandra Williams, while tragic, ultimately affirmed that communities can support each other through the worst of circumstances. I think often about what Sandra would make of all this. If she could somehow witness the years that followed her death, would she be proud of her family's resilience? Would she be grateful for the investigators who never forgot her? Would she find peace in knowing that her killer is now where he belongs? These are questions without answers, but they feel important to ask nevertheless. As we approach the conclusion of this story, I want to reflect on what Sandra Williams's case teaches us about justice, about persistence, and about the human capacity for both evil and redemption. These are large themes, perhaps too large to fully address in any single narrative, but they are present throughout this case in ways that demand acknowledgement. First, justice. We like to think of justice as swift and certain, but the reality, as Sandra's case demonstrates, is often different. Justice can take years, even decades. It can require the development of new technologies, the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, the alignment of circumstances that no one could have predicted. But the delay of justice does not diminish its power when it finally arrives. Benjamin Holmes Jr. was held accountable for his crime. The when of that accountability matters less than the fact of it. Second, persistence. Everyone involved in solving Sandra's case, from the initial investigators to the cold case detectives who ultimately identified Holmes, demonstrated remarkable persistence. They refused to accept that the case was unsolvable. They continued working, continued believing, continued pushing forward even when progress seemed impossible. This persistence was not glamorous. It did not make headlines until the very end, but it was essential to everything that followed. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the case reveals the complexity of human nature. Benjamin Holmes Jr. was capable of terrible violence, yet he also managed to function in society for nearly 2 decades after his crime. He was someone's son, perhaps someone's friend, possibly even someone's partner. The evil he demonstrated in Sandra's home coexisted with whatever ordinary characteristics allowed him to pass as a normal member of the community. This is a disturbing truth about humanity that we must acknowledge even as we condemn his actions. Sandra's family has emerged from this ordeal with a strength that inspires admiration. They waited 19 years for answers. They endured the particular torture of unsolved homicide. They faced the man who killed their loved one in court and maintained their dignity throughout. Their example offers hope to other families still waiting for their own answers, still enduring their own uncertainty. The investigative community has also grown from cases like Sandra's. The techniques developed and refined through cold case work, the databases built and expanded, the protocols established and improved, all of these advances benefit future investigations. Every case solved adds to the body of knowledge that will help solve cases yet to come. I want to circle back to something I asked earlier about what you would do in the position of Sandra's family. Think about the patience required. Think about the faith demanded. Think about waking up every day for 19 years without knowing if justice would ever arrive. And then think about the moment when it finally did. That moment, that resolution, was not just about Benjamin Holmes Jr. facing consequences. It was about validation. It was about being heard. It was about the world acknowledging that Sandra Williams mattered, that her death could not be committed with impunity, that someone would be held responsible. This validation is perhaps the most important thing the justice system can provide to victims and their families. As we prepare to close this narrative, I want to leave you with an image. Picture Sandra's family, gathered together after the verdict. 19 years of waiting have ended. The uncertainty that had become so familiar is suddenly gone. They still miss Sandra. They will always miss Sandra. But they can now remember her without the additional pain of injustice. That moment, that gathering, represents something powerful. It represents the enduring strength of love, the importance of persistence, and the eventual triumph of truth over concealment. It represents everything that Sandra Williams deserved and everything that Benjamin Holmes Jr. tried to deny her. The sun rises over Florida now on a world where justice has been served in Sandra Williams' case. Benjamin Holmes Jr. sits in a prison cell, stripped of the freedom he enjoyed for 19 years at the expense of those who loved Sandra. The investigators who never gave up on her case have moved on to other challenges, carrying with them the satisfaction of a job completed and a debt repaid. And Sandra's family, those who waited so long and bore so much, finally have the answers they deserved. This is not a story about the triumph of evil, though evil certainly plays a role. This is a story about the resilience of justice, about the power of persistence, about the strength of those who refuse to forget. It is a story that began with tragedy but ends with accountability, that started in darkness but concludes in something approaching light. Sandra Williams did not deserve what happened to her. No one deserves violence. No one deserves to have their life stolen by another's rage. But in the aftermath of that undeserved horror, something remarkable occurred. People refused to let her death go unanswered. Investigators kept her file active. Scientists developed new tools. Family members maintained their hope. And eventually, all of these efforts converged on a single point: the arrest and conviction of Benjamin Holmes Jr. The revenge, if we can call it that, is the revenge of justice itself. Holmes thought he had escaped. He thought the passage of time was his ally. He thought that moving forward with his life meant leaving his crime behind. In all of these assumptions, he was profoundly wrong. The DNA evidence collected in 2001 never forgot. It waited patiently for the day when it could speak Sandra's truth. And speak it did. In the courtroom where Holmes was convicted, the evidence told a story of violence and accountability. It connected him irrevocably to the crime scene, to the victim, to the night that changed everything. No amount of denial could overcome that biological testimony. No legal maneuvering could make that DNA disappear. For Sandra's family, the victory is bittersweet in the truest sense. They would trade everything to have her back, to return to the world before that terrible night. But since that return is impossible, they have achieved the next best thing: the knowledge that her killer has been brought to justice. This knowledge does not bring Sandra back, but it does honor her memory in a way that 19 years of uncertainty could not. The community of Pensacola has also been restored, in a sense. The fear that lingered from 2001, the awareness of a killer at large, has been resolved. Families can feel safer knowing that the threat has been identified and removed. The social fabric, torn by Sandra's murder, has been mended with the conviction of her killer. As I close this story, I want to remind you of where we started. A woman named Sandra Williams was killed in 2001. Her killer walked free for nearly 2 decades. And then, through the persistence of investigators and the advancement of science, he was finally brought to justice. This is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth sharing. If this story has moved you, if you feel that Sandra's memory deserves to reach more people, then I ask you again to share this video and subscribe to this channel. There are other stories to tell, other victims to remember, other cases where justice was delayed but not denied. Together, we can ensure that their stories are heard. Sandra Williams matters. Her family's strength matters. The investigators' persistence matters. And the justice finally achieved matters. Let this story be a reminder that the truth, however long it takes, has a way of emerging. Let it be a comfort to families still waiting, a warning to perpetrators still hiding, and a testament to everyone who believes in the eventual triumph of right over wrong. The sun sets now on this story, but it rises tomorrow on new opportunities for justice. Cases are being solved as we speak. Families are receiving answers. The work continues, and will continue, until every victim has been honored and every perpetrator held accountable. Sandra Williams rests easier now, knowing that Benjamin Holmes Jr. will never hurt anyone again. Her family rebuilds, her community heals, and her story lives on in the telling. This is her legacy. This is her victory. And this, at long last, is her justice.